All right, everyone. I am super excited to welcome Molly Downey to the podcast. She is the nutrition manager over at Nutrisense, which is a great company that I have been partnering with. And I'm so excited to welcome you to the show, Molly. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks. I'm excited to be here, and hopefully we can dive into all the questions that everyone has about blood sugar regulation.
Yeah, and CGM, so continuous glucose monitors, have been just life-changing for myself and for so many of my clients. And they require a prescription in the United States and typically are prescribed for individuals with very uncontrolled type 2 diabetes and then, of course, type 1 diabetes. So tell us why someone would want to get a continuous glucose monitor if they don't fit either of those descriptions.
Yeah. So pretty much, as you said, I think when someone thinks of a continuous glucose monitor, they correlate that directly with diabetes, whether that be type 1 or type 2. But what we do at Nutrisense is that we put a preventative lens on utilizing the continuous glucose monitor as a way that not just those who are already in the disease state. So if you have type 2 diabetes can, find benefit from this technology. We believe that even just a generally healthy individual can, find benefit from monitoring their blood sugar levels because everyone responds differently to food, stress, exercise, sleep, which are all variables that can play out in the glucose data. So where we do work with those who have type 2 diabetes at Nutrisense, a lot of our customers are, those who are generally healthy, just looking to optimize their health and their diet. So we work with a lot of athletes, a lot of females who are dealing with hormonal issues, whether that be like menopause or PCOS, and a lot of like the biohacker type are the ones who just are really, really curious about their health and love that data and want that information and that immediate feedback by, whatever is going on in their body. So we can work with a broad spectrum of individuals depending on, whatever it is that they're looking to explore.
Awesome. And you mentioned PCOS. I used to have PCOS. You mentioned you had it. So what got you interested in blood sugar in general?
Yeah. So I became interested because, probably similar to your story, I was experiencing my own personal health issues. So I had finished my training. So I went through and I, am a registered dietitian, but I, started to realize that I was having these issues going on in my own health journey. And I was having, my skin health was bad. I was having brain fog, fatigue. It just felt like I was off at all times. And I wasn't able to pinpoint what was going on. I was going to all these different doctors and, dermatologists. No one was able to help me pinpoint, anything that can satisfy, what's going on with what I was experiencing. So of course I was very frustrated. And I had a flashback to my dietetic internship, and my professor at the time had brought in a glucose meter, and she pricked my finger before class one day, and I was in a fasted state, and my blood sugar was high. And I remember her telling me that she was like, "Molly, you need to go get this checked out. It's, that this is concerning to me." And I never did, but it was always in the back of my mind. So when I reached that peak point of frustration with everything I was experiencing, wasn't able to get the support that I was looking for, I decided to buy a glucose meter on Amazon and started testing my blood sugar. And I was just blown away. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is insane. My fasting levels were high. So we can explore, what all these numbers mean later on. And then also how I was responding to different foods, like carbohydrates were just beyond what, I was like, oh my God, I cannot believe I'm having these high responses. But I was so excited, like, even though the data didn't look good, I was so excited because I was like, finally, I have found at least something that could help bring me in the right direction to pinpoint what exactly was going on with all the symptoms that I was facing. So right around that time, I was looking for a job at the time, and then I found the the job description for Nutrisense, where I'm working currently. And we utilize continuous glucose monitors, and that's, the basis of the job. So I applied, got it. And it just was the most surreal thing too, because I got to actually dive into all the data, work with all these members and see all the different trends that were going on. And it was a few months later that I finally went to the doctor, let him know what was going on. And then I was ultimately diagnosed with PCOS. So this is probably 2 years ago that I was at the peak of like my worst symptoms. But I would say that, of course, there's so many variables at play that help you recover over time and, get into a better place. But being able to monitor my blood sugar levels and seeing that in real time was definitely the catalyst in my, journey to being where I am today. And I feel so much better. Of course, we're never reached that level of perfection. It's just like everything's a continuous journey. And you learn things over time, you become, your habits build and, whatever that is. But I would definitely say that was, the blood sugar monitoring was that catalyst for me. So.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And when I had PCOS, I tested my blood sugar. I went to the doctors multiple times to get different blood work and see different specialists and things. And then I did also test my blood sugar because I just had heard about it on a podcast. And this was even before I was a nutritionist. And my blood sugar always came back low. So it was like 60, 63. I would wake up shaking. My blood sugar would be 60. I would have coffee. It would be 60 again because it would go up and then come down. So I had the issue of hypoglycemia. And this is a lot of the people that I see have hypoglycemia because I feel like so many people are talking about what happens with high blood sugar. So that's, known. I feel like, it's like there's so many good resources for people who have prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, how to reverse that. But so much less is known about people who are struggling with hypoglycemia and reactive hypoglycemia. So from your perspective, can you just kind of talk to us a little bit about people who might be struggling with these low blood sugar symptoms and maybe some numbers or trends that they might see so people might be better able to sort of self-identify?
Yeah, exactly. And I think what you said is a good point where when you are going to the doctor and getting your blood sugar taken, that's only one single snapshot in time. You're missing all the data in between. So you weren't able to see and identify the trends and the fluctuations that were going on. So to you, every time you test, okay, my blood sugar is low, but what was happening that, resulted in that low blood sugar? Like you said, you mentioned reactive hypoglycemia. So this is something that we see all the time in glucose data. It's typically when foods that are higher in carbohydrate concentration, in excess amounts, like refined carbohydrates are consumed in isolation. Our body, you have that large spike in blood sugar, and there is a subsequent insulin response to that in order to metabolize that food. And what happens is like so much, like it's like there's an overproduction of insulin being released, which then ultimately ends in that drop in blood sugar. So as you explained, you start feeling like shaky or dizzy, or someone might get like a headache. So these are all common symptoms that you experience from a reactive hypoglycemic event and low blood sugar. So from my perspectives, it's, working through management techniques to help optimize that response in the first place so that your body is not overproducing that insulin, which will then result in that drop. So something very common and typical that we could do is just adding in a solid piece of protein or fiber before eating that, carbohydrate rich, food or whatever you're trying to eat. Because that can help modulate that glucose response, hopefully resulting in a lower, peak spike, and can keep you from actually, experiencing that dip. So that's something that we see in a lot of members. We also, it doesn't always, some blood sugar dips are, they're not always going to be like food related. So you might see it in the data. So identifying other aspects that are going on or other variables that are going on. It's like, okay, did you sleep well last night? Did you consume, caffeine or coffee, or, was there exercise going on? So you want to look at these other variables and pay attention to how you're feeling subjectively after all of these different situations. So it really just depends. But usually when you do have those dips, I've seen it on the CGM happen to me, and it was scary. But I felt it, and I was wearing CGM at the time. I was like, oh my God, I feel so funky, just so dizzy. I was shaky, and I scanned my sensor and I saw that I was very, very low. So I just ate, I think I ate like a banana and peanut butter or something, and it spiked up my blood sugar back. So I felt honestly better within 10, 15 minutes. So, but that's that to ingest that carbohydrate after the, negative feel within the body already happened, that's kind of like a Band-Aid approach to it. So you want to take a step back and like, how can I prevent this from happening in the first place? So that's typically, the first plan of action that we go to when I'm working with someone.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that, because the idea of correcting with carbs is not something that's going to give you long-term improvement of your blood sugar, because that's only going to, if you have to have a whole banana, it has a ton of carbohydrates. So you get a spike back up again, and then you have that potential to dip again. So the idea is to stay more level. One of the things that I recommend for my people with reactive hypoglycemia, in addition to the protein and the fiber, is a lot of fat. And that seems to be the real key to keeping blood sugar more stable over time, where people can go longer between meals. It does often increase the area under the curve. It's just like it's sort of more spread out. But for these individuals where their blood sugar just keeps dropping, that seems to be the ticket to keep them to being able to go longer between meals. And then we can sort of dial back on some of the fats and the carbs, and have a little bit more balance there. Do you see that as well?
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people come in confused about the fat aspect, because I think it really depends on the situation and the type of food involved, because the fat and carbohydrate combo, if it's like a very processed food, that's probably the worst response you'll see. So if you eat like a burger and, fries, there's oils and everything, you're going to have that high spike from the carbohydrate, but then it's so prolonged because the fat delays that digestion, that you're sitting in those higher levels for a longer period of time. And that's like probably the least ideal response that we could have. However, as you mentioned, if you eat something, in those circumstances where, you're trying to balance out your levels, you eat like an avocado and some nuts and, maybe a little, apple or something, then you likely are going to have a more tolerable response. And you're, again, for satiation between meals, you're not going to have that dip and everything. So it really just depends on like the type of fat being used, and if you're not overdoing it on the refined carbohydrates or anything like that. So
right. Yes, I always recommend whole food carbohydrates as much as possible. And I find that personally, people have such a varied response to the types of carbohydrates. So in my coaching program, some people do really well, like with fruits, and others do terribly with fruits, and they stick more with the grains, and they do better with something like that. So do you see, I think that so much of what's missing from the conversation is this personal nuance that you can't know until you put on a glucose meter. So some people are like, okay, what's a small amount of carbohydrates? A small amount of carbohydrates that's not going to spike your blood sugar is really personal, right? So what are some things that you see with people, like maybe some examples of someone eating something and having just like a crazy response that you maybe wouldn't expect?
Yeah. So again, I agree that you really, since it is so personalized, that you really don't know how you're going to respond to a specific food. So that's why testing and, testing out your own data is so important. I think what you mentioned too, with like the type of carbohydrate, is really interesting too. So like when I first put on the CGM, I was eating, this was way back, and it was before I completely shifted my perspective on like how I eat. And this is when my skin was terrible, but I was eating a bowl of oatmeal with some bananas in it, and my blood sugar spiked out of control. I'm like, oh my God, so this is what I've been eating every single morning. No wonder I'm like then starving in another hour. And, so that was a eye opener for me. But I think what's interesting is my mom also wears a CGM all the time. And we're different in that typically if I like fruit is usually generally okay with me as long as I'm pairing it with like a healthy fat or protein. But my mom is the opposite where, and then like, I'm really bad with more starchy carbohydrates. So
Same.
even if I eat like quinoa or rice, it's just such a bummer because my blood sugar goes crazy. But my mom is opposite where it's just like this more sugary thing. So it's like a fruit, like that totally spikes it, but then she eats pizza or something and she barely responds to it. So I think those things are something to consider too. And I also like, just because you eat something and you don't have a blood sugar response from it, like pizza or something that you would perceive as like a food that's less desirable or less healthy, it doesn't mean that you should eat it all the time, because there's so many other components to our health other than blood sugar. And, those foods can still be disruptive in other ways as well. But yeah, I think I'm trying to think of some of the most interesting tests that I've done. But yeah, I think something that I did, like I think I tried a sandwich one time and had a huge response. And then before I tried out apple cider vinegar before I ate the sandwich, it was like the next day, same exact time, no disruptive or confounding variables at play that could disrupt like my little experiment. And had that, ate the sandwich, and then went for a 30-minute walk after, and I didn't see a spike, versus when I just ate the sandwich in isolation, didn't do anything, then I saw that spike. So that to me has been a consistent motivator where I know, like, even if I'm not wearing a CGM, I know that's something so beneficial for me is just to get a walk after I eat a larger meal. And it's so simple, but it's stuck with me, and that's been such a habit that I've stuck with over time. But it's like, there's so many little things like that you're able to recognize through tracking your blood sugar that, when you can actually visualize it and see it, I think that habit sticks with you better. So.
Yeah, that's great. So one of the things that really struck me when I had a CGM on and I was just doing an experiment was I wasn't expecting this very certain symptom to sort of show up. So the highest I've ever seen my blood sugar spike on a CGM was from a bowl that was the serving size that it said on the box. It was 3/4 of a cup of this paleo cereal. So it was grain-free, gluten-free, GMO-free, everything free, organic, whatever. It was made with cassava flour. So I had a steak, I had green beans. So I had fat, protein, and fiber before I had the cereal. And then I had the 3/4 cups of the cereal, and my blood sugar spiked to 168. And I have never seen it that high. And yeah, cassava really gets me. So it was spiking. And at the very peak of the spike, all I could think of was go get another bowl of cereal. And I was like, wow. And then I was like, no, I'm not going to have another bowl of cereal. And then my brain was like, maybe you should get ice cream. I'm like, what is happening? So it was so wild to me that at the very peak of this spike, all I wanted was more carbohydrates. And so I think that that's a really interesting sort of symptom to have happen when your blood sugar is spiking, not even when it's low. So sometimes even those symptoms that you were mentioning earlier, like feeling dizzy, shaky, hangry, headaches. A headache is a very common one. I had someone else, she said, I put a CGM on and she's like, that's why I get that afternoon headache. I started to notice it was when my blood sugar was highest. That's when I would get the headache. So what are some other, have you seen this before? Like, have you seen other symptoms that kind of are a little weird with, or just kind of curious with the CGMs?
Yeah. So I think they are similar, and some people can have a blood sugar spike, not notice anything. They can't
Mhm.
feel any sort of disruptor. I personally have like extreme heart palpitations. My mom also has the same. So
Yeah.
my heart just starts pounding. So even if I'm not, now I know that through the correlation that I made. So even if I'm not wearing a CGM, I know when I'm having a blood sugar spike because I can feel it, which is pretty cool. I mean, not cool because it's bad, but it's interesting that you're able to form that correlation. But I would say in general, the symptoms with low and high are actually pretty similar. So, some people may feel dizzy, or, they might get that headache when their blood sugar spikes, or the heart palpitations, or, fatigue. They are pretty similar, but it just depends. And I think, again, seeing that data and identifying at what point am I starting to experience this, whether it be high or low, and, just working to avoid that, and put in some sort of prevention measures beforehand.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just love CGMs. So you're able to say, oh, my blood sugar is doing this, and that's why I feel this. So you're able to understand what your body is telling you, because our body speaks in symptoms. It doesn't speak in numbers, right? So it's like, what does a headache and heart palpitations mean? It's like, I could maybe just think I'm anxious, or that's another really common symptom is anxiety. I get so many people coming to me and they're like, I have been on every anti-anxiety medication ever invented, and it wasn't until I stabilized my blood sugar that I stopped having anxiety. So people start to see that if my blood sugar is dropping, oftentimes it's dropping too quickly. That's when they start to feel that anxiety symptom, or if it goes too low, I call that like the craving zone. So, I mean, apparently up high too, but like when it goes down low, you can have these cravings, feel hangry and all that. So the highs and lows can look similar. So let's talk about overnight, because a lot of people, like, I think this is probably the most common issue or question that I get when people get continuous glucose monitor data. So can you tell us more about these overnight data, and then what might affect that, what might come into play, and then especially calling out lows? So if people see these like dips in their blood sugar at night.
Yeah. So this is probably the information that I think is most interesting from looking at all the data, because it's just insane how much your overnight values and fasting levels can change dependent on what different variables are at play. So one of the most common, which I'm sure you're aware of after testing your blood sugar levels, is what you eat the night before and how close that meal is to your bedtime. If you think about it, you eat that meal, and if you go to bed an hour later, your body's not fully processing that meal yet. And then you're sleeping, so there's different hormones at play. So your body then has difficulty metabolizing that meal, resulting in high blood sugar levels overnight. So especially if it's like, as I explained earlier, a high fat, high refined carbohydrate meal, like a burger, or something like that.
Pizza,
I've
ice
seen just
cream.
roller coasters going on all overnight, and I think that's very eye-opening. Or it even can come from like a bowl of ice cream, or some people even eat fruit or a sweet potato at night, and that causes that variation. So not only do you see that represented in the data, the next variable that it can impact is your sleep. So that your blood sugar, in those higher ranges can be very disruptive to your sleep. And also, say that the food wasn't involved. Even if you have poor sleep in general, say you're waking up frequently throughout the night, that is a stressor on the body as well, which can result in higher overnight values. So typically, like if I see someone had those higher values, the first thing I'm going to look at is, what did you eat the night before, and what time was it, and how long was it before you went to bed? Were you able to fully process that? If that wasn't the problem, next thing I'm going to look at is, okay, well, how well did you sleep? Were you waking up often? If they didn't sleep well, then likely it's their overnight values are high because of that. If you exercise very closely to bed, that can impact how your overnight values are as well. And then stress is a huge one. Stress is something that, it's hard to detect, and, we all know that we're experiencing it, but again, some people, it is just a red alarm that you can see it on the glucose data. You know, you can see acute stressors. I've seen like spikes from people being in interviews, or they're in an argument with their spouse and they have this huge spike. But, you know, I think that also plays into overnight values as well. If there's any issues with like hormones, that can have an impact. But obviously there's so many, like that requires a lot of, you know, you have to dive into a lot of different variables to identify like, okay, what actually is going on, you know, with your hormone regulation and everything going on there. So there's multiple factors that we look at. And in respect to your question about the lower glucose spikes in overnight, there are a few things that I consider. The first one being, it could just be sensor related. So if you're laying on the sensor and you're sleeping on it, you're putting pressure on it, it shows like a false dip. So it's usually looks very sharp. So it like kind of looks like sharp, goes up and then goes quickly back or down and then back up. So I would first rule out if it is sensor. So if you know you're laying on the arm, you're sleeping on the arm, then it could potentially be that. If usually when I see those dips overnight, it is in correspondence, and it's actually a blood sugar dip. It's in correspondence with them waking up. So I'll usually ask, okay, when you see that dip that occurred, did you wake up at that time? And if they're like, yes, I did. And it's just like, okay, you know, that to me sounds like an actual blood sugar dip, and you're experiencing symptoms from it, resulting in you waking up.
I agree.
So the problem that, or how I usually address that problem, is going again back to dinner time and, you know, nighttime routine, you know, making sure everything is good before bed. But with dinner, what usually I find, it's like that reactive, like hypoglycemic response, but it's delayed and it shows up overnight. So if you eat, you know, a higher carbohydrate meal and there's like some fat involved, and if you eat later on and it's right before bed again, that usually can result. And if you struggle with hypoglycemic symptoms, that usually is what's promoting that. So I'll usually suggest trying out some experiments, like, okay, let's just try a solid piece of protein and veggies and just try to stick to like a very, very low carb meal and see if you still experience those dips, because that could help with the higher protein. Some people actually need a little bit of carbohydrate to be in a sufficient sleep and, you know, to feel satisfied going to bed. So if we do add in some carbohydrates, I just make sure that they're in controlled amounts. Start with a small amount, and then we can titrate up to like almost find your like sweet spot for the carbohydrate that you're able to tolerate. And then, you know, working with that and seeing how your blood sugar dips overnight respond with those different variables. But usually I find that it's typically what you're eating the night before that can really help with that.
Yeah, I see this a lot as well. And my students and my clients with reactive hypoglycemia, depending on the state of their adrenals and their cortisol levels, like if they just are super burnt and they have really low cortisol levels, that's a huge sign. If they're sort of having those drops overnight, it's that their body doesn't have enough hormones to keep their blood sugar in this happy space. Typically, I find that my clients do really, really well, or best, I would say, if they have beef or lamb or pork at night because of the carnitine content. And, you know, I've had clients in my membership in my program say, they're like, no matter what I do, like if I don't have meat, I'm waking up in the middle of the night. But if I have the beef, it's like, it's better than fish or chicken or turkey or whatever it is. And they're like, there's something about this that really, really helps. And I think that when the fat content, it comes with the protein, that's when it's really powerful. And they can add there. And I get this from my clients all the time. They're like, I can have fish and then I can add as much fat on the side, you know, avocados and nuts and butter and olive oil. And they're like, you know, gram for gram, it's the exact same as the beef meal, but the beef works better. And I find that as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, I even find it with myself, with my own hunger levels. Like if I eat fish or chicken, I'm going to be hungry like 2 or 3 hours later. Whereas if I eat something like red meat, I could be full for hours. I don't know.
Very similar. And I found that like if I eat it midday, like I started eating when I was in my initial transition out from like the way I was eating before into eating more like meat and red meat and everything. I started eating at midday and my energy, because that's usually I would have a drop, and I still kind of do around like 2 p.m. And when I eat that meal with either like a steak or like ground beef or something, my energy is so much more sustained until nighttime. It's incredible. So
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. So the overnight lows, it could be the sensor, check if you're waking up. And I always ask people, like, how are you feeling? Maybe you didn't wake up, but are you feeling like you got a good rest or not? I also ask if when you woke up, was your heart pounding? So the heart palpitation is really that meaning that the adrenals had to come in, pump your body with all these stress hormones to get your blood sugar back up. That's sort of how it got back up. And that wakes you up because now you're flooded with, epinephrine, which is adrenaline. So then we talked about nighttime. We talked about setting ourselves up for a good night's sleep with finding the right balance, the right amounts of carbs for you, having a good amount of protein and fat, not eating too close to bed. And then there's the morning. So a lot of people will say, my morning levels, like I just can't get them down no matter what I do. They see these highs in the morning. If you are someone who has hypoglycemia, you might wake up, you might be shaky and like need to eat immediately. That was me. My blood sugar would go lower and lower overnight until I'd wake up feeling that blood sugar low in the morning. And that's when I would need to eat because I had a lot of excess insulin in my system. So other people are getting these highs in the morning. So what's the advice out there? How can we make sense of all this?
Yeah, and I think overnight and then morning fasting levels kind of correspond with each other. So the same variables that are impacting your overnight values are also impacting your morning values. I would say in general, fasting values are one of the most difficult. If there's not like a quick fix that works right away with like meal adjustment time or maybe you're drinking at night or like something like that is a quick fix, you remove it and immediately you see that improvement in fasting levels. If you're like following all the protocols, doing all the right things, then that's when I'm like, okay, to me, there is a degree of insulin resistance likely at play, which is going to be more difficult to nudge. It can take anywhere from like 3 months to 6 months and sometimes even like a year. And I think it's dependent on that degree of insulin resistance to really budge that fasting glucose level. But like I said, if you're just beginning to test it out, I would first experiment with meals the night before, working on sleep improvements. If you know that you're someone who's very overwhelmed, very prone to stress, something that I do is I just meditate before I go to bed, puts me in a relaxed state. And I've seen that could even be beneficial as well. So working with the variables that I mentioned and going from there, but there is it is a difficult one to nudge if there are issues going on. So I know it can be frustrating. So, I think focusing too on what is most meaningful to me from like a health optimization standpoint is working to regulate your responses to the meals that you're having. Because if you think about it, if you eat and then you're having these high blood sugar spikes that are going beyond the threshold. So at Nutrisense, we have the threshold set at 140 milligrams per deciliter, but it changes dependent on the person, like whatever they want to set their goal to, but we just have that as the general recommendation. So if you're going beyond that threshold on a consistent basis, then every time that's happening, you are, promoting stress on the body. You're more susceptible to inflammation, cellular damage, oxidative stress when you're in those higher levels. And the longer amount of time that you're in those high ranges, the more that those issues can come into play. So whenever I'm like looking at someone's data from like a high level perspective, if their fasting's high, if they're having poor postprandial or post-meal responses, what I'm going to focus on first is post-meal responses, because working to regulate that first, so there's not so much stress on the body constantly trying to like modulate these swings that are going on, then that's going to like calm the body down first. And then, working on optimizing those fasting values would be like step 2. But it is a struggle for a lot of people to ultimately, lower those fasting values as well. But I would say for overall health and wellness, like working on the postprandial, post-meal responses is step 1.
Right. That's where we have the control. That's why when I was struggling with PCOS and I was trying to affect my progesterone and my estrogen and my testosterone, like I couldn't make a dent in that. And what I could make a huge dent in was the hormonal responses from my meals, because insulin is a hormone. And so if I could eat in a way, you talked about some of the hacks, apple cider vinegar, walking after the meals, adding fiber, protein, and fats to your meals, eating whole food carbohydrates, not having, naked carbs, as we call them, which are just carbs by themselves. So we can make all these changes, and that can drastically impact the hormonal response that each meal has. And so instead of 3+ times a day, because typically people who are metabolically inflexible and struggling with all these issues are not only eating 3 times a day. I was a grazer, so I would just be eating. I couldn't even count how many times I ate a day, because I was always just like walking through the kitchen, throwing something in my mouth. Right. And so it was just a little bit of almonds, just some blueberries, just a bite of this granola bar, like just a couple of sips of my smoothie. Like it was always something, right? So we're constantly throughout the day spiking our blood sugar and our insulin. So that is that chronic, like you said, we're getting the inflammation, we're getting the oxidative stress, and then we're spiking a hormone that's going to dysregulate our other hormones. So by working on all those factors, controlling the meal, then we can control what happens after the meal. And that over time is going to lead to those improvements in that morning fasting glucose that you're going to see, but it takes that time. So would you say that it's easier to impact that postprandial response, right? So that post-meal response that we can see changes with pretty quickly, right?
Yeah, I agree with what you expressed. And I'm sure that you work with the same, like your clientele and trying to solve these issues. But yeah, I love, and this is what I express to my members as well, that you have control over the meals that you're eating. And that is a quick fix. Like you'll see that feedback, if you're adding in protein, or you're walking after, or you're eating primarily whole foods versus refined carbohydrates or the processed foods that you're eating, you will see that impact almost immediately in your blood sugar level. And that's something that changes quickly. Again, it's in your control. Whereas fasting glucose, there's more implications like hormones, your degree of insulin resistance, so many different issues at play that are less out of your control and just so much more deeper rooted that take so much more time. So like you said, just always starting with those things that you have more control over. For example, like if you are a grazer and, if you're eating frequently throughout the day, typically the first recommendation I give is like, okay, let's just experiment and see like, what does 3 meals in a day look like? And like perhaps a snack or whatever seems reasonable for them. And, what they have the availability to do in their day. But how do you feel and how does your blood sugar look when you're eating like more consistent meals rather than like frequently just like activating your system over and over again and not being able to like fully recover? And then your blood sugar is just kind of going all over the place, and just seeing how you respond from that. I would say that like, I don't believe that there's any like right or wrong way when it comes to like frequency of, your meals, because I've found that some people, especially who struggle with like hypoglycemia or, something like that, like working in like energy levels and, stuff like that, sometimes even more frequent meals, as long as they are like balanced, that can be more nourishing for them. So I found that it really just depends on the individual, and it comes down to experimenting, testing out your different options and seeing the result and seeing how you feel based on, the frequency of your meals.
Yeah, I personally think that most people, I'd say I have the goal for all of my clients to eat approximately 3 meals, give or take. Um, and the people who need to eat frequently, like I usually get people coming to me and they're eating maybe like 10, 20 times a day because their blood sugar keeps crashing. So the goal that I have with them is to design their plate and to support the inner workings of their body. So whether it be their adrenals, their minerals, whatever it is that's like keeping their blood sugar dropping, we aim to get them stabilized and then start seeing if they can increase the time between those meals, because they're setting themselves up with such a really well-designed plate that works for them. And eventually they get to what they find is like, there's no way, like they start the program, there's like, they say, there's no way I'll be able to eat fewer than, 7 times a day. And a month later, they're eating 3 meals and be fine in between, and so I think that it's about also working on these root causes and things like that. But of course, there's pregnancy, there's breastfeeding, there's athletes. So everyone is going to have, there is still bio individuality. But I also think that I always like that ancestral sort of reflection and say that, okay, our ancestors, humans, were not designed to be grazing. We didn't have refrigerators, right? Like we killed something and we would eat and then stop eating. And I think that the digestive sort of piece of this is really important too. So if you're eating all the time, your migrating motor complex, which is this sort of process that happens, it just sort of like sweeps everything through your intestines. If you are constantly eating, that migrating motor complex is not activated. And so then you can experience issues with constipation. You're never giving your digestive system a break and all these things. So I think that for me, I like to say that that's my goal for all my clients, to be able to get that break between eating and at night, because so many people are like, I have to wake up and eat. And so the goal is to always work on these root causes. And sometimes it goes beyond just building the plate. Like we need to look at the adrenals. We need to look at, are you digesting fat? Are you deficient in certain minerals? And so that's what I'm able to do with my clients. And that seems to really help them be able to make more spaces. But of course, we want people to, the first step is always stability. So if you need to eat, if you're like, Danny, I need to have 3 meals and 3 mini meals. I don't like to use the word snack because I think it conjures up the idea of snack foods. But if I say mini meal, you're thinking about a meal. It's balanced, right? So a snack is more likely to be something like popcorn or granola or a naked carb, right? So I talk about mini meals and I say, if you have to have 3 meals and 3 mini meals to start to like stay stable, hell yeah, do that. Like do whatever stays stable and then work on slowly reducing that. So yeah, I think we're on the same page there.
Yeah. And again, it just comes down to that period of time where it just takes, like some people are going to take more time to be able to adjust to, the less frequent meals, and just Absolutely. Like small titration, small goals each week, just trying to get there. And then ultimately, being able to get to that point. So
yeah, I have people, I'm like, okay, like you're at the point where you're stable. I want you to move your lunch like 10 minutes. Like, I mean, we're talking tiny scale. It's not like, oh, I'm just going to stop eating my mid-afternoon snack out of the blue one day, right? So we're talking about these micro movements for things so we don't stress out the body even more. So I think we talked about the basic trends that you as a dietitian is looking for when it comes to the help that you give people through the Nutrisense app. So I think that's something that I maybe didn't state. So when you sign up for Nutrisense, if you use my code SUGAR, you get a free month of dietitian support. And then you can also pay to continue working with this dietitian so they can help you, just like Molly, help you interpret this data. So you would be looking at the fasting glucose, what happens after meals. And then I think you said glycemic variability. So can you talk to us about what that means?
Yeah, so with glycemic variability, it's just essentially your swings in glucose and how often that's happening. So as I was explaining earlier, like with your postprandial, post-meal responses, is that we want to avoid that consistent fluctuation that is occurring. So these consistent swings, say if they're happening like 3-4 times a day, that's stressful to the body. So that variability up, down, up, down, up, down is what we're recognizing. So again, as I said, like working to control that and to make it so, it's okay to have a response from, a food that you're eating, especially with carbohydrate, you're going to respond a little bit. We just want it within that threshold. We don't want it to be a huge swing. So that's something that we're monitoring. We look at the delta value of just like how many points you spike. So generally speaking, we like to stay optimally below like a 30-point jump. But beyond that would, be considered in my mind as like a higher response. Some people can spike like or jump 100 points, which is a huge swing. And I like to, if you think about it from the perspective of like what is going on within the body, your hormones being released, like it's like I think of it as like a little machinery, and it's just like, okay, this is out of range, and all these operations then have to go on within your body to help get that back within range. So yeah, glycemic variability is something that we're monitoring. And of course, with longevity and optimizing your health, like that's something that we want to consider as well, because again, as I said, like when you go in those higher ranges, you're further inducing that inflammation, oxidative stress, cellular damage, all which can lead to these issues down the road, whether that be like diabetes, heart disease, all these different things. So it's kind of just like a preventative way to start recognizing these trends within your body and working to regulate them for preventative health.
Yeah, that's great. That's really important. And I think that's what people might miss or, not know how to check. They might check an individual point in time. They might look at like 2 hours after a meal, but I always talk about you have to check. That's the beauty of the continuous glucose monitor, because it's not just a finger prick. So you can see the pattern of what's happening after meals. I do want to just sort of pull out something you said so I can emphasize it, that I don't want people to aim for a flat glucose line. If your glucose line is flat, it means you're dead. So it's going to move. It's natural that it moves. Like we have this little range that it can move up and down. It's like, oh my gosh, I ate, some chicken and my glucose spiked a little bit. It's like, it's okay. Like it's okay to have a little bit. What is the most important, I think, is making sure that you're sort of staying within that 30 spike, right? And seeing how you feel. Are you able to make it to the next meal without being hungry? Do you feel energized? Is your brain on, or are you feeling anxious? Are you craving? Are you like, did your mood drop? Did you need to eat something else? Like that's the most important thing. And I think that the numbers are helping us connect, like I said, with what we feel, so then we can understand how we feel. But it really comes down to like, how are you feeling in your body? How are you sleeping that night? Like how was your period that month? I mean, all of this stuff impacts. So these are the numbers and the data points to look at that can help us sort of make sense of different things in our health, like in the bigger picture. So the last question I have is about alcohol. So I stopped drinking alcohol in 2020 just because it does not agree with my body. And I've never tested alcohol on a CGM. And I heard from someone, she's like, I drank alcohol and my glucose numbers were so low the next morning and they were in the perfect range and they were the best I've ever seen it. So should I drink? And she's like, I don't think the answer is I should drink alcohol, but my blood sugar was like perfect because it's normally pretty high. And then I also have people with hypoglycemia saying, oh my goodness, I woke up in the middle of the night, my heart was pounding, it was racing. So can you tell us the impact of alcohol maybe on the short term and on our blood sugar?
Yeah. So I think it's really interesting to test out alcohol on the CGM, but it can be, deceptive. As you said, your client mentioned like, oh, is this good for me? Because my blood sugar went down. It depends on the type of alcohol. So say that you're drinking like a glass of wine, dry wine or, a spirit, something with very little sugar, what happens is your body prioritizes breaking down the alcohol because your body's seeing it as like a toxin. I need to digest this, break it down, metabolize it, get it out. So it will prioritize that over anything else that your body's trying to digest. So what happens with like wine, and I've tested it out on the CGM, is you will see typically a dip in glucose. And again, it's that your body prioritizing breaking down that alcohol. However, that's just the immediate result. So usually within like a few hours afterwards. And for this example, say that you're just drinking wine, like no food is involved. Then usually what I see though is like your overnight values and your fasting values are significantly impacted, being higher than what your usual values are. So that's something that is to be considered. Also, if say that you eat a large meal, so say, again, let's use the burger and fry example. I eat that burger and fry, no alcohol is involved. I have a huge spike from it. And, you go up very high, comes back down. And then the next day you try the exact same meal, you have that burger and fry, except you have, 2 or 3 glasses of wine with it. You're not going to see that immediate spike for the most part because your body's breaking down that alcohol. But what happens for most people is that spike shows up in the middle of the night and it's like a crazy high thing, and it can last. I've seen it last all the way into the morning, and like you see just this roller coaster going on because it's just a delayed response to the alcohol. So, and I don't know if, despite even blood sugar, if you're wearing an Oura ring or you can detect your heart rate variability or resting heart rate, you like alcohol disrupts your sleep completely. And even if it's just like one glass of wine, and you can see, as I mentioned earlier, even if the meal isn't involved, poor sleep can impact your blood sugar levels, resulting in levels being higher. But I've seen people who follow like very regimented diets and, their blood sugar's in check, everything's going well. They have wine one night or start drinking one night. And I've seen it take like a week almost to fully recover and like get them back into that positive flow. That's like an extreme case of someone who's just responds very poorly to it. But yeah, in general, you have, it's not, even if you see that low spike, it's not a good thing. So,
Yeah, that's really helpful information. And that makes sense with the delayed response of the delayed glucose response from the food, because the oxidative priority is to get rid of the alcohol first, get it out of there, and then it can process the food. So the idea that is like, that could be compounding sleep as well. And that's really why I stopped drinking, because I would see it on my Oura ring, my HRV, which is normally, let's say like in the average of like the 50s or something in the night, it would be like 2 or 11 or something with like one glass of wine in the afternoon. I'm like, it's not even worth it just to have the 1 or 2 just for a terrible night's sleep. And then you wake up and then I'm so tired the next day. But that's, neither here nor there. But it really does impact our blood sugar levels, not in a good way, even though it might sort of show up that way. It's not doing good things for our bodies or for our blood sugar regulation system. And our liver, which is one of our primary organs of blood sugar regulation. So we really want to take care of our liver. And so that nightly glass of wine to unwind has really, really, really big consequences over time. So finding another way to unwind at night that doesn't involve even THC or alcohol or anything like that. Breath work is wonderful for elevating your state, and, or even just pouring like a sparkling water in a wine glass and doing the same exact thing, like sitting on your patio and watching the sunset, like do the same thing, but just take the alcohol out of it. And I've had so many people start my program and they stop drinking with that. And they're like, oh my gosh, my energy is so much better. And my blood sugar is so much better because they're sleeping so much better. So anything that's going to impact our sleep will have a really negative effect on our blood sugar, and then vice versa, because they have that bi-directional relationship. So I think that we've covered lots of things. We talked about caffeine and sleep and alcohol and the morning and the evening. So I guess anything else that you can think of about continuous glucose monitors that you feel like are important for people to know, or something that you wish you knew before you had one, how to get the best out of it?
I think honestly, just it's important for, I think, everyone to try at some point in your life or intermittently throughout, over the years, because you are able to see something within your body and the different trends that are going on that you wouldn't be able to recognize otherwise. So I think it's valuable for everyone. I've had my entire family try it out. I have all my friends try it out, because you really don't know what's going on unless you test it out and try it. And it's great. And it's awesome information. And yeah, just so everyone knows too, with Nutrisense, like, oh my gosh, I dropped my thing. With Nutrisense, we have an app. So you scan the data from the glucose meter, everything gets recognized in the app. So everything comes up in graph form. You can log your meals, your activity, your sleep. You can sync up with like Oura Ring, and yep, beautiful. So everything is represented in there. And then with the dietitian support that is complimentary, all the support, it goes on within the app through chat. It's all chat based, but
yeah, through the messaging feature. So everything's right here in the app. How do you sync up your Oura Ring to it?
It's a new feature that we have. So you can go into just settings and you should be able to sync it.
I am so excited right now.
I
Okay, cool. I'll have to figure it out.
Release this because it might be in beta, but if not, it's going to be coming out in the next couple of months.
All right, cool. Well, I'm excited. And oh yeah, I don't have a sensor on, so maybe that's why it won't let me right now. But yeah, that will be a really cool feature, because and that will be really, really helpful for people who are experiencing those overnight lows, and just to start looking, because I'm always looking at like the wake ups and being like, does that correlate? So it's kind of hard to see. But now this will make it much easier to see that, is the wake up due to a blood sugar low, or is it due to REM sleep? Because sometimes in REM, our blood sugar just drops and we're fine. That's just part of it. So yeah, really cool information. I absolutely love CGMs, and I love the support from Nutrisense and the app. You can log the meals, and then it will show you that, like you talked about, that delta value. So if you're doing experiments, like, what is the effect of having the apple cider vinegar? Oh, it lowered it this many points. Like, you get this like really, really usable, tangible data. And yeah, it's just so helpful. So thank you, Molly. Thanks for being here. And thanks for sharing all this great information with us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.